My mission is to teach history through art and to make people think more critically about false narratives. I'm Jim McMurtry, and welcome to my classroom. The painting that we have with us today, this is another lesson, and I think it's really important if we can to get what they call primary source material. But there was nobody living amongst the Indigenous people on the west coast of Canada hundreds of years ago. So the painting that we're using was produced, painted in 1988, under contract with the by a man named Francois and Girard, but it was contracted by the Canadian Museum of History. So certainly the researchers, the intent was there to get this right. So there's lots of things to talk about, and I'd like to start, as you can see on the right hand side of the painting, that there are prisoners of war, and I'm not saying that was an essential feature, but that is an important feature because people lived in some peril. It wasn't an easy place to be because there were lots of people raiding, and particularly in the area around Vancouver. And this is similar to that area in the southwest coastal area, British Columbia, because in the summer and early fall, there was an abundance of fish. And then it's important to make there was a time of the year there was not much fish, not much even of Ulicon or the smelt, also called candlefish, or in the Fraser River. So there was an abundance of food at a certain time of the year, and lots of different groupings of First Nations congregated, and that brought conflict. And so there was an awful lot of taking people prisoner and slaves. And if one ever reads the early journals, which is quite fascinating, of the first settlement in the coastal part of British Columbia called Fort Langley. But there were young slaves even at the fort, but they weren't there with the Hudson Bay Company workers. They were there because the men all ended up marrying Indigenous women. When I say marry, that was more of a marriage of convenience. It was for a summer or a year or two, and then often it broken up. But there were children introduced into these families, and in some cases they became permanent. But it wasn't uncommon for the wives, we call them perhaps country wives, and the Indigenous women to have their own slaves, including children. So that's part of the story, and I'm building up to something, as you'll see in a minute. The next thing, on the other side of the painting, you have a man with wearing what is a spruce hat. It looks like a hard bark, or just maybe completely out of wood. Um, but he's got three rings, and those three rings symbolize that he's participated in three potlatches. And that's a salient point because what school kids are taught is that the Canadian government was really very brutal toward its First Peoples, and one of the things they do is they ban cultural practices like the Sundance, and particularly for people who live where I do in British Columbia, the potlatch. But I want you to know that the slaves that were caught in war were often traded in these potlatches and sometimes ceremonially killed as an expression or as a statement. The next thing is when there was warfare, the women weren't killed very often because they were useful slaves. The children as well. But older women tended to be killed and babies tended to be killed, but men were normally killed. And so that's one of the sad things. And that's why you can see in a couple in the middle, you can see a couple of heads on spears. So it's anyhow, that's part of the story. Also, if you drive around the southern British Columbia or into northern Washington State, you'll see signs for that use the word flathead. The reason they did that is because there were Indigenous people on the coast who deformed their heads as a sign of being upper class, and they flattened their head in this way, and that's where the term flathead comes from. The next thing, they also cut the hair often of slaves, and I think that's interesting because there's an awful lot of negative attention toward residential schools because students had their hair cut, but because there were problems with lice and so forth. It wasn't in any way to establish them as a lower social class. The next thing I'd like to say to you is about cedar. You can see in the distance in the middle of the painting that they're dug out cedar canoes. And cedar is wonderful because its oil is so good at preserving. It's not something insects like, and anyhow, it's still used cedar. If you have for people who have a porch in front of their house or a dock at a cottage or whatever, and it's just an example of many indigenous people with their ingenuity and how to live without metallurgy, without electricity, without a lot of the things that, of course, we've long taken for granted. Yeah, and you can also see in the painting, you can see plank houses, and that's how they lived. And they never lived permanently in one place. They might have a permanent winter house, which would be what you're seeing there. But in the summertime, they'd follow the fish, and they would go up, and they'd have their own spot, as each nation did along the Fraser River and other rivers, and because that was the luxury. So again, they were semi-nomadic, and their houses. And nothing interesting about the plank houses to say briefly is there was two ways of getting the smoke to go out because there was no chimney. One of them was to with a long pole to move the planks that were on the top of the house apart so smoke could escape and air could get in. And the other one was to just leave permanently a space. So you can imagine during the rain that we have here in the winter in Vancouver. So that wasn't perfect, but it was obviously very successful. And then there were multiple families living in these homes. And when they went in the summertime to establish their summer camps, again up the Fraser River in many cases, they would often take the planks with them on their dugouts. Did the planks look exactly as they look in this painting? No, because they didn't have, as said, metallurgy, so they didn't have saws and they didn't have axes, so the wood wouldn't be as neatly um, um, cut. But it was quite ingenious how they did it. That they would take huge trees and they would split them, and they would split them by banging in stone different types, and further and further, and then the tree would naturally split. So um, and obsidian was particularly valuable because it was sharp, the volcanic glass. Another thing that I'd like to mention here, there's whispers of cannibalism, and that's true of all parts of the world. So I just say this much. I don't believe, and I've done enough research on it to feel somewhat confident, if not very confident, that it wasn't easy to have enough food because the Yukon weren't in the river in abundance until later in the spring. The fish weren't, the salmon weren't in abundance in the rivers until in the summer, and particularly later summer, early fall. So there was a time in the year that was very hard, and civilization everywhere in the world depended on people being able to store food, having a surplus production of food, and be able to get through the dead months of winter, of unproductive agricultural, or in this particular case, hunting and gathering time. The next thing is kind of interesting. I think, as we look at this in an overall way, is to try to ascertain what does this mean? What does this painting say? And I can't help but think of the British philosopher Hobbes, who talked about life back in time when he lived a couple hundred years ago as being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that's really the point of this exercise and looking at this painting today is in schools, and again, that's my domain as a longtime teacher. Kids are made to believe with all these D words and decolonialism and deconstructionism and really destruction itself. This idea that we need to take away from what we've achieved. And I think, and if you look long at this painting, if you can see that the people are wearing the inner bark of a cedar tree, that's what the people are wearing for clothes, and that wouldn't be ideal. But it was smart because it was rain resistant. But what we have today is infinitely better. And I'm not an apologist for the world that we live in 2024, with wars in Israel and in Ukraine and in many places, Sudan and so forth, in Africa and elsewhere. I think all people in all parts of the world have struggled in one way or another. But I'm proud of what we have accomplished in the Western world, and particularly in Canada. And I think it's absolutely nonsensical for us to look again at this painting of recreations of what was life was like for our first peoples before Europeans came here. And the first European on the coast was 1791, and coming into Vancouver. George Vancouver himself was the next year, 1792. So that's fairly recent. But up until that time, life was not easy. So I think the message that should be given to school children is to learn about the past, because how Indigenous people lived in the wilderness in Canada was no different from how people in other cultures lived in their wildernesses, at whatever time they were in history. And pause and be realistic for a moment and recognize that we have achieved so much as a society here in Canada. And this idea that we need to tear it down in any way, and for what? It wasn't a Garden of Eden back in time for Indigenous people. Their lives are infinitely longer now. They have the things that we all, again, to a large extent, don't think much about, but are absolutely essential, whether it's a grocery store, or indoor plumbing and heating, or just the very idea that we can do what we're doing right now with advanced technology and soon to be increasingly artificial technology and information. So I just say that yes, learn about the past, look at paintings like this, look about anything that is a marker for us of what life was like for us and others back in time, and for of course people like the Coast Salish and the Haida, only a couple hundred years ago. But don't convince children that the answer to any problems today with any grouping of people is to go back in time. I think that's really unfair to kids, and I think we should never turn their heads to something that can't be recreated anyway. But also get them to be as best equipped and as strong as possible in meeting the challenges of the future. So that's my optimistic note. This is how life was not so long ago. It isn't like that today in British Columbia, and that's something we should all be proud of, including Indigenous people, because they made many contributions, including things like in the eucalyptus plant and so forth, creating aspirin, and I've already talked about cedar, but they had many things that were particularly important and most important for young people to know what is the how to stave off scurvy by getting vitamin C and from tree leaves and so forth and needles. So thank you for listening. Bye for now.